All right, let's dive right into this. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a pretty fascinating topic, biofuels, specifically their policy dependence and the regulatory landscape. We're going to explore this really intense push and pull relationship between biofuel production, government policies, and the on-the-ground environmental realities that can literally make or break a company's bottom line.
If you've ever wondered how dry regulatory frameworks and sustainability metrics actually translate into real-world financial risk, well, you are definitely in the right place. Just think about this central paradox for a second. We're looking at an industry inherently tied to the natural world, right? They're using organic feedstocks to manufacture renewable fuels. But its massive global growth, that hasn't just been some organic product of natural free market demand. Actually, it's heavily reliant on government mandates and subsidies. So we really have to ask the big question. What happens when an industry's biggest lifeline, the very policies keeping the lights on, becomes its biggest liability, threatened by the side effects of its own rapid growth?
So to really understand that risk, we first have to understand the lifeline itself. The rapid expansion of global biofuels production didn't happen in a vacuum. It's been heavily encouraged by government energy policies. You see, governments worldwide are scrambling to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions from transportation and, cut down their reliance on fossil fuels. And how exactly are they doing this? Well, by stepping in to manually create market demand and incentivize supply. They mandate biofuel blending into regular fuels, and they offer huge financial support for feedstock production. For the biofuels industry, this regulatory framework isn't just a nice little bonus, it's absolutely crucial. It is the fundamental baseline for their very survival and growth. Now, what's really fascinating here is the sheer variety of financial levers governments pull to prop up this industry. Just look at this ledger for a second. Under the SASB standards, specifically metric RRBI 530A.1, companies are actually asked to track exactly where all this money comes from. And we aren't just talking about a single simple tax break. Oh no, it is a highly complex web. We've got blending and production tax credits. We've got direct capital grants, loans, and loan guarantees. It even extends to import tariffs or surcharges slapped onto competing products just to give biofuels a competitive edge, plus heavy funding for research and development. Simply put, this massive influx of capital is literally what makes biofuel refining economically viable in a lot of regions.
Because this ledger is so critical, those SASB standards require biofuel entities to put it all out there. They have to disclose the aggregate monetary amount of all these subsidies recognized in their reporting year, right in their presentation currency. And listen, this is definitely not just some dry accounting exercise. It's a hardcore transparency metric. It shows investors and stakeholders exactly how much of a company's bottom line is directly dependent on government support programs across all jurisdictional levels. In a way, it puts a very specific, undeniable price tag on the company's reliance on current political will.
But here is the catch. That rigid financial ledger we just looked at, it's sitting right on top of a very shifting political landscape. This is exactly where the tension arises. Now, regulatory support provides fantastic, undeniably positive short-term gains. It supports the market, boosts production, and keeps those financial numbers looking incredibly healthy. But the SASB framework highlights a massive, looming caveat. The long-term, adverse environmental impacts from actually producing all these biofuels, they can completely threaten that very same support.
We're talking about environmental externalities here. Think about it. A rapidly growing proportion of the world's arable land is now occupied just by biofuel crops. And the SASB standards note that using unsustainable cultivation practices to feed this massive demand can create some seriously negative impacts. We're looking at things like deforestation, devastating biodiversity loss, soil degradation, and severe water pollution. And guys, these aren't just abstract, faraway environmental concerns. These are the massive, long-term catches to those short-term financial gains we just talked about.
So, what does this all mean for a focused investor or a corporate strategist? Well, it's a classic domino effect. As those negative environmental externalities start to stack up, there is a very real, very dangerous potential for a reduction or even a complete loss of public and political support. I mean, if the public suddenly turns against biofuel mandates because they're tired of seeing deforestation or water pollution, guess what? The political will just evaporates. And then the dominoes fall. Suddenly those nice tax deductions disappear. Renewable fuel mandates are reversed. Compliance costs absolutely skyrocket. Basically, this shifting political landscape directly threatens the very financial viability we were just looking at. Now, to actually manage this chaos, the SASB framework is meticulously designed to track these exact operational and environmental risk factors. As you can see, it requires hard, quantitative metrics on air emissions, on water management in manufacturing, like specifically how much water is being withdrawn from high-stress regions, and it looks at life cycle greenhouse gas emissions broken down by biofuel type. It literally tracks everything from hazardous air pollutants all the way to non-compliance incidents. And why go into all this detail? Because actively, rigorously managing these specific environmental impacts is exactly how a company maintains its alignment with those absolutely crucial regulatory standards. Which brings us to a bit of a crossroads. Knowing that your revenue is heavily propped up by government policies that could literally be reversed overnight if your environmental footprint gets too heavy, how do corporate strategists actually manage this kind of unpredictable regulatory uncertainty? Like, how do you even begin to plan for the future when the fundamental rules of the game are constantly subject to change?
Well, the SASB documentation actually offers a really clear perspective on this. They state that biofuels entities may benefit from developing clear strategies for engaging regulators that are aligned with long-term sustainable business outcomes and that account for environmental externalities. So, the crucial point here, burying your head in the sand is just not an option anymore. Managing this risk requires highly proactive, forward-looking, sustainable planning. Essentially, you have to account for these environmental externalities long before the regulators step in and do it for you. And to enforce that, SASB metric RRBI 53A.2 literally requires companies to discuss their overall corporate strategy for managing these legal and regulatory risks, both on a domestic and a global scale. This means they have to actively disclose their plans for the future across 3 distinct areas. First up, altering business structures. Are they changing their overall business models to mitigate this risk? Second, developing new technologies. Are they investing heavily in R&D for, say, alternative feedstocks that are way less susceptible to drought or disease? And third, modifying operational processes. Are they updating organizational controls and safety structures to ensure compliance and prevent that environmental damage in the first place? Bottom line, they have to show their work.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate takeaway of our explainer today. The financial impact of ignoring these risks is absolutely profound. Misalignment with the legal and regulatory environment, that doesn't just mean a little slap on the wrist anymore. It actively, aggressively threatens a company's cost of capital, its community relations, and its overall stakeholder trust. Think about it. If an entity is perceived to be at a higher risk of regulatory penalties or policy reversals just because of environmental negligence, their access to finance becomes incredibly constrained. The environmental ledger and the financial ledger, they are permanently linked. So it leaves us with a truly complex, fascinating tension to ponder. As we look at the broader transition to a greener economy, how can industries ever truly balance such a heavy reliance on government policy with the unpredictable, messy nature of real-world environmental impacts? It really is a delicate dance between chasing those lucrative green subsidies and actually genuinely operating sustainably. Keep that in mind the very next time you see a headline about renewable fuel mandates. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive today, and as always, keep learning.